We're really excited to have you watching us live. Our show is brought to you by the Intel IT Center and the IT Transformation Institute. My name is Corinne Buchanan, and I will help facilitate today's show. Before we begin our conversation with our host, Charles Araujo, I want to remind you that you can use the hashtag TransformIT to leave any comments or questions for our guest. I'll now hand the conversation over to Charlie, and who will introduce our guest and kick off today's discussion.
All right, thanks, Corinne. I get my last swig of coffee in as we get this show on the road. Today's actually going to be a very different sort of hangout because uniquely, we actually have our show guest, Rob Lloyd, the CIO for the City of Avondale, with us on the hangout today. So I think our big opportunity is going to be to dive a little bit deeper into a few of the most interesting parts of the interview and kind of really climb inside of Rob's mind to see what he was thinking when he said these crazy things. So I'm really looking forward to that. And to help us do that today is we have a couple people with us. We have Frank Granito, a veteran IT leader from a number of large federal government IT organizations, and of course the indefatigable Chris Peters from Intel. So
man, that announcement gets better and better each week, every month. I don't know, Charlie.
That's right. You know, I got to keep it fun. So I think we have this unique opportunity today to kind of get a little bit deeper into what's happening around us as seen through the lens of government. And I think what's interesting is I think that it's kind of this window, right? So we have both kind of the smaller government, we have the big government perspective, but I think there's going to be lessons for all of us in that and how it all pulls together. So I think it's going to be a fascinating conversation. And let's get to it. In this first clip, we're going to hear Rob talk about a concept that he called tech debt. And that's a concept or a phrase that really resonated with Frank when he and I were chatting about this episode before this. And ironically, since then, it's a phrase I've heard a couple of times. So I don't know, Rob, if maybe this phrase is catching on and it's starting to really get out there. But in either case, it's a powerful concept, and it's an important place for us to start today. So, Corinne, why don't you play the first clip?
A lot of organizations carry some tech debt. And the concept behind that is when you try to move fast, like in the private sector, sometimes you innovate, you build, and you even sometimes make decisions that later on you're going to have to come back to. And in government, a lot of times the discussion and the reality is that you're making decisions just to get by. And that builds and accrues a tech debt bank that holds you back. So when someone needs something, we don't have that skill set, or this application isn't current, so we can't take advantage of that feature, or these applications don't talk to each other because one's so far back and one's so far forward, or this area of the organization's resourced and this side of the organization is not. And so one of the things that has been an underpinning of progress in making IT responsive to an organization, I think, is paying off that tech debt. And what that means is that you have a good understanding of what your IT portfolio is. That means the people and the technologies and relationships with departments. Then you have a platform on which you can build. And so there's some analogs in.
So let me start with you, Frank. When you and I were talking about this, you immediately kind of brought that up as something that resonated with you. And you're, I'm not sure how much you're allowed to say as far as the organizations you've worked in, but I mean, clearly a very large federal government type organization. So, I mean, how did you respond to this? What did you think when you heard Rob say this?
Well, it really did resonate with me, and like you, Charlie, I've used this phrase actually with a client yesterday, and it was a private sector client, but I'm seeing no difference between the public and private sector in running up tech debt. But let's stick to the topic of government tech debt. And what I found, and this is where it really resonated with me, was the process itself really made for tech debt as a natural outcome, because there's a budget cycle and it's hard to plan. You're usually in an August or July-August time frame. You would have to find ways to spend money. And so you would naturally round up or accumulate tech debt because you had to make decisions based on those constraints or exigencies. So what I would try to do is I would try to focus my initiatives in what I call usable segments. And that's a term I think that I made up, but you can use it if you want. But a usable segment is something that if you built it and stood it alone, it would serve an end-use function. But that usable segment was also constructed with building the end in mind. So you could build onto it in subsequent iterations. So I tried to use the concept of usable segments when I justified my expenditures, especially at the end of the fiscal year. And what that did was actually provided me with a good deal of acceptance, because I could show how these things worked on their own and could be extended strategically. So tactically, a usable segment, but strategically extended. And one more point I'd like to make off this: I love that concept of tech debt. And if you permit me to extend it, not only do you have tech debt, but if we borrow from our federal system of nomenclature, we also have the interest on the debt. So you're paying off the debt, and you're attempting to pay off the interest on the debt. So when you accumulate that tech debt, you also have the interest. So for me, it was a usable segment trying to combat the issue of building up tech debt as a natural outcome in the government process.
Well, it's funny, and I don't know if it's entirely unique to IT, but I know that Martha Heller, in her book, The CIO Paradox, was quoting one CIO who said, in effect, that the CIO is a unique executive in many organizations because, unlike most of their counterparts, they are living with decisions that were literally made 10, 15, 20 years before. And so, Chris, how did you respond when Rob was talking about this, and in kind of the worldview that you have, and the relevance to maybe the broader business world?
Yeah, there's a lot of things to react to, especially as Frank went. And we may come back to this, but the end in mind and Covey, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of Covey and fast is slow and slow is fast decision making, but maybe we'll come back around to that. But I think this aspect of tech debt, exists everywhere, or organizational debt, if I can phrase another thing, is it's the legacy that you leave behind from previous decisions, and you always have to be operating with that in mind. And I think, Rob, you said it really well. Debt is required, it's useful, but it's also constraining. And I think the thing that we need to try to do in today's world, where agility and speed and the ability to adapt are so critical in today's business environment, is to make decisions where you can make a direction today, but realize you might go 2 or 3 different directions off of that in the future, and plan for that agility and make sure that that's built into your decision-making process.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think that is part of the big issue that tech. I mean, it's why I love the term so much. So, Rob, I'm curious. It's been a couple of months. I'm not sure 2 or 3 months since we filmed that. Have you reflected any further on it? I mean, as we've kind of been stirring this pot a little bit. Any further ideas around this? Rob, you there? Did we lose you?
Hey guys, can you hear me?
There you go.
I've lost sound.
Try it now. I think you just came back.
Ah, there we are. Sorry, I think the Microsoft Surface doesn't like the Google Snap thing. I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Sorry, I was just saying it was been 2 to 3 months or so since we filmed this episode, and I'm just curious if you've had a chance to reflect on any of these ideas since we talked about them live. I mean, it's certainly this idea that has resonated with me at the time, and it clearly has resonated with others. I'm just curious if you've thought about it anymore, and if that's changed anything.
No, I think it's a matter of practice. So, like Frank alluded to, is enough of us run into these challenges, and I don't think they are government specific, or because our private sector friends talk about the same things, just in different ways. And for the friends that I have, it's more about you make decisions to hit your bonuses, and you're going to regret them later. But for government, it's very much a matter, an artifact of the process. But I think that Frank alluded to a good point, is we all have our strategies. And so in terms of his usable components, or the terminology he used, we have in our infrastructure systems plan and other plans, for example, a way to silo, what we call silo it, which is we try to make our investments land in a budget year, so that instead of replacing components and then asking for a big dollar amount at the end to replace that entire thing, we try to steer all that environment to expire as much as possible in a year on our obsolescence schedule, so we can re-architect it as a matter of design. So for example, network, routers every year, or we say our entire router infrastructure comes to its obsolescence date in about 12 to 18 months. And so we can try to re-architect that as part of the process. On the application side, our strategy is as a service and COTS first, then platforms second, and custom only if we have to. And so those are ways and mechanisms that you try to manage the tech debt. So on your question, Charlie, I think nothing profound in terms of revelations, but it did stir some additional thoughts in how we pieced this together as kind of a programmatic approach. While it's, in my mind, it was probably more just practice than a full model. You're making me realize some of these strategies we've chosen kind of fit together on purpose, but we didn't realize how big a picture it was.
Well, I think what's interesting about it is that well, to a certain extent, what we're talking is very tactical, right? I mean, Frank dove into this whole thing about the budget cycles, and you're talking about this obsolescence schedule, and it's a very tactical thing. But I think what's important, and this is a big risk for I think a lot of us in IT, is that we have to be dealing with these tactical issues because that's the pathway to getting to the strategic conversation, which I think is a nice segue for us because, as we've discussed, at the end of the day, doing this and retiring that tech debt and using it effectively and dealing with all this, but to do it strategically with that open mind is really what sets you up to become truly innovative. And you talked about this in a second clip about how important it is through that process to get everyone engaged. And while this clip isn't talking about it, one of the dots that we connected here is until you've dealt with that tech debt, it's hard to create that engagement, right, and to set up that culture of innovation. And so I think there's some important lessons, and it's an important transition. So let's watch the second clip, Corinne.
Experience. When you're willing to talk and listen and then get it done, you're in the strongest position that you could ever imagine because it's a joint effort, it's a shared endeavor, and everyone's commitment level goes way up. They're invested at that point. They're not just involved. For us, we've listened. We've been able to do a lot of innovative projects, the places I've been, because that's where the support was in the organization, what they were wanting. So what does that mean? Digital Cities of America, at least in this organization, and we've been one of the top 10 last 4 years, number 1 2 years in a row. And then we've had a Digital Government Achievement Award, top 25 doers, dreamers, and drivers. So it's really paid off. But more than that, our customer satisfaction rate on our internal services survey is at 90+%, and it's been there for 3 years. So when you listen and it's a shared effort, it really pays off because everyone's mind is in the right place to do good things using technology. It's not IT pushing things on the organization.
So, Chris, one of the things that I love about the show is that while we talk about technology, what we're hitting on really is a set of what become universal truths. And I think this is kind of one of them, right? This idea that when you listen, when you engage people, when it becomes about more than just any one group pushing something, that's when the magic happens, so to speak, right? And I really, it's funny, this came at the end of the first segment, and yet this was, I think, one of the secret sauces of the entire episode. So, I mean, how did you react to what he had to say, and how do you see it apply?
Yeah, I think it's actually very consistent with some of the things we've heard in other shows, Charlie, around a strong vision, a strong collaboration model, and trying to avoid what I'll call the organizational debt, right? It wasn't invented here, right? We have to build on what did before us, right? Because rip and replace is not a method that's really possible in today's environment within business. And so how do you build on top of, and the way you do that is by establishing a very strong vision, shared vision across the organization of where you want to go. And then if you can get folks rallied behind that and innovating and collaborating toward that, the path you take is going to vary because based on budget cycles, based on available technology, the timing of when you need to update infrastructure and to drop security holes and things like that, and to evolve to what your customers need. And I know, Rob, you mentioned this at one point, is the cycle of sitting down with your business partners and talking about, and I love this, here's what we did the last 2 weeks, here's what's still on the plan, and by the way, is this still the right stuff? And having that ability and agility to have that conversation, I think, is really critical to say, you know what we did 2 weeks ago might not still be right. Let's double check before we take the next 2-week chunk.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Rob, I'm curious. One of the things that when I was watching the clip back, I almost wasn't sure. It's like, were you talking about your customers? Were you talking about your staff? And then I realized the answer was probably yes, and it probably didn't matter. But I'm curious. I mean, were you talking about one or the other? Do you see it applying to both? I mean, how did that work?
So we actually do it with both, and so every week we have a director staff meeting here, and that's really how we keep our organization in alignment. You spend an hour of your 40 hours just saying, at the executive level, is everyone still marching in the right order and working together? And I think the point is very salient that Chris made is it is a matter of practice, but I'd also add that it's a matter of culture. Not every organization is ready or capable of doing this well, and so when we have that discussion and we say maybe the highest priority for IT has changed in the last 2 weeks, and often we see that coming from the discussions we have, but we take that directly to the staff almost immediately thereafter, right? Because within that week, we then adjust our work patterns. We say, all right, so this project is going to take a lower priority, this one's going to take a higher, okay, we have a new initiative there, here's how it's going to fit into our work streams that we have actually mapped up, if you can see behind me. So we say who's doing what, when, and with whom. And those relationships have to stay key. But one of the big things that we did that I think I mentioned in the interview was bring in the organization and say, if we're going to do more Agile and deconstruct our project management office, it's cultural. It's not just a matter of practice or rigor. It is culture. And so some organizations, parts of our organizations, there's a few that really prefer that old style and command and control. And it's like, all right, that's fine. You'll still be part of the conversation where your stuff lands. But when we work with you, we'll work in that traditional PMO 1.0 type style. And for the others that really wanted to say, I want to move fast and admit sometimes I don't know what I want, but I have a dream, and I'm willing to work with you and vet that out, and they're able to move with us and do those sprints type approach.
So I think it's fascinating. And Frank, I realized I failed in my introduction of you, that I failed to address you properly, which is Dr. Frank Granito. And your doctorate actually was in this whole idea of organizational change and the organizational dynamics and specific types of organizations. And so I'm really curious from your perspective and with that view, how important is this level of engagement that Rob's explaining here? I mean, how do you see that play out?
Well, very, very interesting. First, I find the idea of language is incredibly important to a culture. So if you're going to try to do something in an Agile format, you at least try to start using the language. So if you're in Italy, you speak Italian. When you're in France, you speak French. When you're doing Agile, you speak Agile. And the customs and the language all go to the culture. And that's something that was really interesting that I found, and I kind of lost the original thread of the question, but the idea of collaboration and vision, from a culture standpoint, I found what Chris and Rob have both said really go back to some really good scholarly literature, and that is the Cotter model. And the Cotter model is, you create a sense of urgency, you build a coalition, you have a vision, you have, you enlist your volunteers, things of that nature. And I think inherently we all kind of do that in order to be successful. And when I did it that way, and then I started looking into research, I said, my goodness, I'm actually using a seminal model. So it's really about sometimes personal relationships, having that vision. And if I could hearken back to the earlier point Rob made about these implementing these silos or what have you, and I know what you mean in the best possible way, but I think the budget cycle and natural constraints of government force us to plan force us to plan smartly, because we have tight budgets, constraints of cycle, And we actually, as leaders, we have to have that vision so we can piece it together tactically, one by one in a building block, and actually get to that end state. So it actually forces good planning, which I found really, really interesting in my experience. So language, Cotter model, and good planning. There you go.
So, well, Frank, it's clear that you've lived in the D.C. area for a long time because you're well trained to answer the question you wanted to be asked, not the one that it's okay.
I thought I answered some of it, though, didn't I?
It was great. It was great. But you all allude to what I think is the most interesting part of this interview, and that I want to finish on this. And that is this idea of agile strategic planning. That how and I think what I found most interesting about this clip that we're going to share is how it really forced a shift in identity when it's done right. And I think I'm such a huge believer in this need for IT folks to shift their view of their own identity that I thought that this was a really important part of the interview. So we're going to let Rob bask in the glow of his own interview one last time, and Corinne, play the clip.
The Agile IT strategic plan is that if you take a step back and look at what it happened in the IT, stop thinking in terms of technology, right? We're no longer technicians, and I think this is true. Department is coach our. You're not just an programmer. Be something. Solutions person and a person who matches the organization. So in our case as a municipal government, we talk with our staff that you're now an economic developer. You're now an engineer assistant. But and that's where
So was that cutting out for anyone else, or was that just me? It was cutting out?
Cutting out.
Okay, so I'll just paraphrase it a little bit. That clip was basically talking about as you go through the strategic planning process that suddenly you have to start thinking about helping the staff think about themselves as not just an IT person but an economic developer, and Rob went on with a bunch of those kind of examples. So, and I know Rob, you and I talked off camera about this very topic and the difficulty in both the power in it and the difficulty in it. So maybe you can re-paraphrase a little bit and kind of share some of that conversation about, one, how hard it is and maybe some of the processes you used to actually get people to see themselves in this different light, and then the power that generated when you did that.
Sure. So the premise is very much from the Agile methodology and the sense that we have to understand our customers. We have to be very fluid and active with them. And so above all else, it is a matter of being part of the organization at a higher level, not just operating technologies. And when you have that relationship, I think it gives you a level of credibility that a lot of IT people need but lack, because you can speak across needs, you can speak across the organizational barriers, and people kind of perceive you as that organizational angel. And then if you pair that with the ability to execute, then the entire organization views IT as a resource that's change done. And so, I often tell our staff, what we do is who we are. The projects and initiatives that we work on with our organization are the aspirations of who we are. But realize the importance of everything that we do in building that future us and making those services that are going to make our community exceptional. And then along with that is the coaching, right? Because not every IT person is going to have their identity set in that mode. Some of them very much want to be technicians of a certain nature, experts in a certain domain. Others really want to be part of that larger picture. And so in terms of the coaching that we have to do is here's where you want to take your career, here's where our portfolio is going, and where we can line you up. Sometimes we have to have very frank conversations. You want to go into a realm that we're not going to make a priority in our organization. How can we still help you, get a good work out of you, and then also help you move to a place where that's going to pay off? And then for the circle back on the conversation is, in every IT shop I've ever been in, when you get in, they ask you, how are you going to get them more money? How are you going to get them more training dollars? How are you going to get them more visibility and respect? And when you are part of it and it's a paired process and everyone's invested together, that solves itself. So in terms of budget, when you go to the council, commission, board, Congress, I guess, in Frank's situation, and you say, we're proposing this together, we've vetted it, we have as much of the detail as we can to eliminate that fuzzy start, the money's there because we've pitched it together and the organization has said it's important. And then for training, they understand the tech debt concept, and we're paying that down so we can execute and have a continuing credibility that we're going to get the things we want done. And so they see the payoffs in the sense that organizationally, we don't have to worry about those benign issues, sometimes those malignant issues, that we're not resourced the right way because we've matched it with what we're trying to do.
So Chris, how did you? I mean, I think this whole idea of the Agile piece, both in terms of, and you already alluded to it, right? This constant checking that's going on, which I think takes a tremendous amount of both discipline and maturity and confidence, I think, to be able to open that door, right? As opposed to a lot of the IT organizations that maybe kind of say, okay, you gave us the budget, now leave us alone, we're going to go do our thing, right? So I think there's that, and then the shifting identity. I mean, what's your take on how those all fit together?
Yeah, there are actually kind of two things. One, where this segment really focuses on the people development, right? And who are you and what's your identity? And in the clip, Rob, you talked a lot about the investment you're doing with the people, right? And being able to change the skill set. And one of the models that we've used at Intel, and it's a very simple model. We call it the TOPS model. You're trying to always align individuals' talents with their passions and with the organizational needs. And there's always a dynamic change around all of those things because people's interests change, right? Their skill sets are always constantly evolving in the organization's needs. And within that framework, you're always looking for that overlap. And so, and critical that is to developing those skill sets and setting the direction where you need to go. And innovation doesn't happen without people, right? And the work plan doesn't happen without people. So I think making sure that you're investing in those people is really key, and it's part of the culture change aspect that you're talking about, Rob, and I think it's really paramount. Regardless of where you are, whether you're in IT or in business, this model applies. The other thing I just want to add that I really liked from the clip that Rob did is I hate the word strategic plan or strategic vision because they're not actionable. And one of the things that Rob did was he identified it was a strategic work plan. And this whole idea of how do you actually get things done and start to evolve today. And that strategy is not just something that exists for 3-4 years out. It's how are we realizing that strategy today? And I think Frank mentioned this is when the budget cycle and, hey, we got some extra money, we got to spend something. If you don't have that strategic framework of where you want to go, then you absolutely will just create more tech debt because you're going to spend to meet the short term as opposed to the long term. So I think all of this stuff really combines together really well in this.
So, Frank, I'm really curious as we wrap this up from your perspective, because I can already hear the critics saying, yeah, well, this is great. I'm glad it works for Rob, but he works in a small city, right, government type institute. How does this? I mean, do you see this working in a large enterprise where you've worked in organizations where there's tens of thousands of people in IT. This agile strategic planning. I mean, do you see it as applicable in the worlds that you've worked in?
It's very, very difficult. So let's not kid ourselves. Very, very difficult. And what you have to understand is it takes the work of the visionary to do it. You almost have to work a little bit outside of the established process, but not so far outside that you're being illegal, so to speak, or non-compliant. So it has to do with building that coalition and being the visionary, and it caused me a lot of gray hair. At least I have it, right, Charlie?
Hey, we didn't have to get personal there.
If I can add on to that, I have my worries how applicable it is at scale, because I've focused on mid-sized organizations because you kind of have that agility, and I don't think in very large organizations and the way the federal government's structured and oversight from Congress and the Senate and those kinds of things, if it is doable in that sense, same as holacracy, it's structurally opposed to that kind of culture. And so I think you almost have to restructure and divide and have a different team approach to to be able to do that, and then the portfolio level gets a lot more advanced. But I don't think a lot of organizations can pull it off either because of culture or because of structure.
Yeah, and I know you have to wrap up, and I'll be real quick about it. It comes down to walking around, building that personal relationship, talking to the people you need to talk to within the bounds of the regulations.
Yeah, I agree. I think, my 2 cents on it as we wrap this up is that, structurally it may look different. I think the idea, and this is kind of what Chris was alluding to, is this is a cultural viewpoint. You have to come into it willing to approach this. I mean, Intel actually it has some really good examples of applying some of these principles, and they're obviously a very large organization. So I think it is, and that's the big takeaway I think for everyone should be, how can you apply some of these ideas and bring them in? And Frank, you mentioned earlier in the conversation that language is important. So by talking about Agile, by using the term work plan, by focusing on action, it really does start changing. I think that's probably the one big message that I took away from Rob's interview is how do you put all that together. So believe it or not, we are at the end of our show. These 30 minutes always just fly by. But I would like to thank today's guests, Chris Peters, of course, Frank Granito, and Rob Lloyd, the show guest himself, to join us and to be able to take this a little bit deeper. I think it was some great insights, great advice that really helps us kind of sink our teeth into this. I'm sure that everyone watching is going to find something that they can take and apply tomorrow. And if that's true for you and you've watched this, please don't forget to join in the conversation by using the hashtag TransformIT on Twitter. And then don't forget to watch the rest of the Transform IT shows that are sitting out on digitalfuture.tv. So that's it. Corinne is having some technical difficulties, so I'm going to go and close this out. Thank all of you for joining us on the show, and make sure you tune in to our next episode, which will be airing in a couple of weeks with Genevieve Bell from Intel. It's going to be a fantastic show. So with that, thank you all, and thanks for joining the Hangout. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.